Under the radar, okay? When we look at the civil rights movement, a lot of times women go under the radar. And I want to mention a few individuals, and I have some photographs so that you can put a face to the name of the individuals. Now, even though I'm starting with Rosa Parks, I'm not going to tell her whole story because you all know her story. You've heard it over and over again. I want to borrow from a radio program years ago entitled The Rest of the Story, okay? The rest of the story. We don't hear about the rest of Rosa Parks' story. She was born in 1913 in Alabama and was a graduate of Alabama State College. But her grandfather, interestingly enough, taught her a couple of things. For example, he said that she should be a proud Black American and not accept bad treatment from anybody. Right? And she remembered that. But here's what I want to get at, the rest of the story. Certainly, we know the story about her in Montgomery on the bus. But she worked for the NAACP, the local NAACP. And in 1947, there was a Black woman by the name of Recy Taylor who was walking home from church one night with another woman and her 18-year-old son. A group of 7 white men stopped them, grabbed Recy Taylor, drove off to an isolated area. When they got there, one of them pointed a gun at her and said, "Get them rags off or I'll kill you and leave you down here in the woods." Recy Taylor was raped. E.D. Nixon, the local head of the NAACP, sent Rosa Parks to investigate and to bring about justice for Recy Taylor. So it's not that she just sat on the bus. She was an active participant in the NAACP. Now, she did start the Alabama Committee for Equal Justice, but they weren't able to bring about justice for Recy Taylor. None of the 7 individuals was indicted. The sheriff even knew, because when she told him, they were driving a green car, the sheriff immediately knew who she was talking about, but didn't arrest them. And there is an excellent book by a woman named Danielle McGuire called At the Dark End of the Street: Black Women, Rape, and the Civil Rights Movement. Okay? And they talk about these individuals and rape one after another, and it's a sad book, and you shake your head at some of the instances. But this is what McGuire said. She said that sexual and racial violence functioned as a tool of coercion, control, and harassment and terror. This was used as an intimidating factor. We'll talk about Fannie Lou Hamer in a minute. Fannie Lou Hamer, under these same conditions, said this, quote, "A Black woman's body was never hers alone." Gunnar Myrdal was a scholar years ago and wrote on the history of blacks in America, said that sex was the principle around which the whole structure of segregation is organized. And it's interesting. Look at some of these statements. This is Leander Perez, a Louisiana politician. He told supporters that the goal of integration was miscegenation, that is, interracial sexual relations. And he's saying that was the goal of integration. Quote, "You make a Negro believe he is equal to the white people, and the first thing he wants is a white woman. And that's why there are so many criminal assaults and rapes." Herman Talmadge, Georgia senator, said this, quote, "The ultimate aim and goal of NAACP leaders is the complete intermingling of the races, even marriage." And so that was a very hot topic, this idea of miscegenation. And you see it throughout the civil rights movement. Anytime there would be a white female and a black male, and we'll talk about one of the white females in a little bit who was involved in the civil rights movement and talks about it. So Daniel McGuire, At the Dark End of the Street, talks more about that episode in the civil rights movement. If you can scroll down just one, and there's Rosa Parks, the first two. This is Joanne Robinson. Joanne Robinson holding her picture up when she was arrested. She too has gone unrecognized because as soon as Rosa Parks was arrested, Joanne Robinson went to work. Now, she belonged to a local organization called the Women's Political Council that got involved in civic affairs in Montgomery, Alabama, voting rights, assisting rape victims. And she stayed up. In fact, Rosa Parks was arrested on a Friday, and there was a call for a one-day boycott for that Monday. And she stayed up most of the night on Friday night, mimeographing flyers that would be passed out on Sunday at church calling for the one-day boycott. And many of you remember I'm not talking about how easy it is now to copy something. You just hit a button. Back then, it's that old mimeograph machine. Well, that's what she was doing. She taught at Alabama State College, Joanne Robinson. And not only did she do that, but she was a prime person in the day-to-day activities throughout the entire Montgomery campaign. They formed what was called the Montgomery Improvement Association that led the campaign to desegregate the bus system there. Not only was it Joanne Robinson, but basically it was women who led the day-to-day activities in that whole Montgomery campaign. So Joanne Robinson, another one of the heralded individuals in this time period. Let's scroll down to another. Now, again, this person is well recognized, Coretta Scott King. But again, I want to tell you the rest of the story, okay? Because she's overshadowed. Her husband casts a huge shadow over the entire civil rights movement. And so we have to sort of dig a little deeper to get some of the other individuals who were involved. And Coretta Scott King, one of those individuals, born in 1927 in Alabama, learned of the racial circumstances early. 15 years old, a group of whites burned down her family's home. So she learned early on that there was a struggle. In college, at Antioch College in Ohio, she learned about serving humanity and trying to bring about this ideal community, a service to humankind and a world view. But when she, and by the way, she graduated from Antioch College, then she went to the New England Conservatory of Music because she wanted to be a concert singer. But then she married Martin Luther King. Now that curtailed her singing career, but it didn't stop her from singing. She did hold concerts throughout her time with him to bring about money. She was raising money for the movement with her concerts. And the movement always needed money because so many people were being arrested and they had to pay bail. So she was integral in that. And she said that, yes, she married Martin Luther King, but even more important, she married the movement. She said that's what drove her. And she, too, risked her life. There was one day that she was sitting in the front part of her house with a friend of hers. They heard a thump. They immediately ran to the back of the house. And after the explosion, they went back to where they were sitting, and it was demolished. So they would have been killed in that explosion. Also, she saw things as a collaboration between her and her husband because she took notes. She critiqued his sermons and his speeches and read over his speeches and typed speeches in sermons. as well as singing at various concerts, and continued the work after his death. She continued fighting for labor rights, voting rights, even fighting for rights in South Africa. So Coretta Scott King, and just a small little moment. I was sitting in let me mention this personal experience. I was sitting at a civil rights conference in Washington, D.C. in this big old auditorium. I was sitting by the door. There's an empty seat in front of me. In walks Coretta Scott King and sits right in front of me. Now, my breath stopped. Now, fortunately, she was only there for 10 minutes because I held my breath for the entire 10 minutes. I mean, I could reach out and touch Coretta Scott King. And so it's amazing. And then what's interesting, a couple weeks ago, I have 10-year-old twin granddaughters. And so they wanted to go to the MLK monument. So I took them. Don't you know, while we're there, MLK's son was standing right there, and all these people were lined up taking pictures there, and they were freaking out. That's his son? That's his son? So I got a picture of that as well. So Coretta Scott King, we've sort of got to dig her out from that shadow that King sort of spreads over everyone. If we go to the next slide or next photograph, there's one at the top here is Septima Clark. Septima Clark. And usually, well, actually Ella Baker. Let's do Ella Baker first. Maybe, yeah, we'll do Ella Baker. Ella Baker is the second one here. Yeah, this is Ella Baker. Ella Baker, to me, is one of the most phenomenal individuals because of all that she did. Now, she was born in around early 1903, and she eventually is raised in North Carolina and will graduate from Shaw College, an HBCU in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is an activist. She will work with the NAACP. But here's what's interesting, a couple things that are interesting. Very thoughtful person. She wasn't just an automaton, she was assessing things. All of these individuals were assessing, and very bright and very committed individuals. One of the things Ella Baker talked about was grassroots democracy, grassroots, and a group-centered type of leadership. She said when you go into a community, you don't build up just one person, because if that one person is gone, then the movement collapses. She says you go in and you try and facilitate. You try and get the best out of as many people. You make as many leaders as you can in the community. That's what Ella Baker was talking about, a group-centered type of grassroots democracy. For a time, she worked with the NAACP. She worked with the NAACP, and she still had problems with the NAACP. And by the way, when we look at the NAACP that was started in 1909, we look at it today and most people think it's all black. Okay? It's never been all black. In fact, the primary movers in starting the NAACP were white. And the first black president of the NAACP doesn't come about until around 1920, even though it was started in 1909. But here's what she had to say about the NAACP. One of her criticisms. She said one thing that they did is they looked too much, they focused too much on trying to gain recognition from the white community. And she says, you don't need to get that recognition. You don't have to have so much focus on that. She said the NAACP had too much of a middle class agenda. What about lower class blacks? And that was a problem. Okay, many times in the black community, people thought, oh, well, it was only reaching out to the middle class and not to a lower class. So there was some criticism there. But I want to mention her activities with the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ella Baker helped to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was in the aftermath of the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay? And an integrated organization, but what she did is she was the only woman who was the executive director. Basically, all the other leaders were black male ministers. Right? And that's the problem right there. Here's what Ella Baker said, because what she found out is these ministers did not want to take her suggestion seriously. They basically wanted to ignore her. And she wasn't one to be ignored because she had more experience at activism than all of them put together. Because she had been out there. She had been director of the NAACP branches, helping to organize different branches. So she knew what she was doing, yet they wanted to ignore her. Here's what she said, quote, "I had known that there would never be any role for me in a leadership capacity with SCLC. Why? First, I'm a woman. Also, I'm not a minister. The basic attitude of men, and especially ministers, as to the role of women in their church is that of taking orders, not providing leadership." So that's what she was fighting against as the executive, and she's not going to be the executive director very long. They're going to push her out. But before, she does have something to say about MLK. I'm going to quote her again on MLK. She says, "He wasn't the kind of person you could engage in dialogue with if the dialogue questioned the rightness of his position." Also, as one scholar said, Baker came to regard MLK as a rather pompous preacher with little political awareness, but with an inflated sense of self-importance and a condescending attitude to women. So that's what she found in her years with the SCLC, but just crucial. And I want to take it a step further with Ella Baker. Not only did she serve, and when we look at the civil rights organizations around late 50s, early 60s, in addition to the NAACP, there was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly referred to as SNCC, there was the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. Okay? Now, 1960, all of you've heard of the sit-ins. They were sporadic throughout the South. College students were sitting in at different restaurants, Woolworths, and so forth. But they were sporadic. It was Ella Baker who told the young college students, you need to formally organize yourselves. And she helped to organize a meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, and out of that meeting came the formal organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. So she helped to bring about one of the key organizations while also serving in another key organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But she told the young college students, she said, whatever you do, don't come under the umbrella of SCLC. Meaning she was saying, be independent from these ministers. They're a little slow on things. And there will be friction between SCLC and SNCC throughout the civil rights movement. One of the things that, one of the complaints SNCC had is that they would get in there. For example, imagine you're with SNCC and they drop you in a small town in Mississippi and they say, okay, start a voting rights campaign. You're in the middle of Mississippi. So you get out there and you're struggling and you do all this groundwork, and then a speaker, they're going to have a speaker, King comes in. Well, they forget all about you because King gets everything. And so there was some resentment there. And again, the young folks of SNCC, they wanted to move. They're ready to go. And SCLC is a little more cautious. So Ella Baker, pivotal in helping to bring about Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but told them that stay independent. Now, if we go back up, there's Septima Clark. And usually people don't hear about Septima Clark. It was just one, yeah, there she is. Septima Clark, born in 1898 in South Carolina, and she will earn a degree from Benedict College in South Carolina, and she will earn her master's degree from Hampton Institute, as it was called at the time. She too worked for, and by the way, she became a teacher. And just to give you another example of the treatment of individuals at that time. 1950s, she belonged to the NAACP. The state legislature of South Carolina passed a law that said if you're a state employee, and teachers were state employees, you could not belong to any civil rights organization. You couldn't even belong to a civil rights organization. Well, she refused to leave the NAACP, so she was fired from her teaching job, Septima Clark. But ultimately, and she worked with the NAACP, but then she winds up working with SCLC as well, and she becomes Director of Education and Teaching. And their responsibility was to teach people about citizenship, to teach people about voting registration, even teach people literacy, how to keep their checkbooks. This is what Septima Clark was doing as Director of Education and Teaching with SCLC. However, she too is going to have her run-ins with King. Here's what she says. She sent a letter to King telling him not to lead all the marches, but develop leaders who could lead their own marches, similar to what Ella Baker was saying. You don't prop up just this one leader. You have a lot of leaders. And interesting enough, once King was taken out, what does happen? 1968, he's assassinated, and to some extent, civil rights movement collapsed. But what Ella Baker was saying, what Septima Clark is, you have to groom a lot of leaders. This is what she says about her letter. She sent that letter to King. She said, King read the letter before his staff, and they laughed at her letter. Hmm? She was concerned about King's inability to treat women as equals. So again, there is this issue that women were facing even as they risked their lives during the civil rights movement. If we can go to go down one, okay, Ruby Doris Smith Robinson. Another one of these just phenomenal individuals, born in 1942 in Atlanta, Georgia. She was a student at Spelman, all women's school in Atlanta, Georgia. And she joins the movement. But here's one of the problems. At some of the HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, they would expel students if they join the movement. And you might scratch your head and say, why would they expel individuals? And they're talking about equal justice. Because those institutions were receiving state funds. And if the governor hears their students are participating in these marches and protests, then state funds might be cut off. Well, she leaves Spelman. Now, later she'll go back and finish. But for a while, she's involved in the sit-ins and a number of the protests. But one of the things she participates in is the Freedom Rides. This was from the Congress of Racial Equality, the Freedom Rides. It's hard to come across more courageous individuals than some of these young people in SNCC and CORE and SCLC. The Freedom Rides, their goal was to go from Washington, D.C. down to New Orleans, riding the buses, Greyhound, Trailways. It would be an integrated group. They would sit anywhere on the bus. When they got to bus terminals, the white Freedom Riders would go into the black section. The black Freedom Riders would go into the white section to show that the bus terminals and the buses were desegregated. But just to give you an idea, before they left Washington, D.C., okay, many of them wrote down next of kin and how to get in touch with them so that they could come and claim the body. That's before they left. And so she's going to be one of these Freedom Riders. And at Jackson, Mississippi, when they got to Jackson, Mississippi, they're going to be arrested and sent to one of the worst prisons in the country, Parchment Farm in Mississippi. And so Doris Robinson will be among those individuals. And they say that once they got there, the women were in one section, the men were in another section. They started singing freedom songs back and forth to each other, and the guards didn't like it, and they tried to say, look, you better stop that or we're going to take your mattresses. So they came in, took the mattresses, and as one Freedom Rider said, the steel foundation of the beds were freezing cold, and they only had like a T-shirt and shorts. So the next day they came through, and they were singing again because they wouldn't stop to try and lift their spirits. So when you read about the Freedom Rides, it is incredible, the bravery of some of those individuals and what they were up against. So she participated in that. But the other reason I want to mention her is she became one of the executive leaders in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Again, an integrated organization, SNCC. She ran into trouble by being a strict kind of leader. That's what she was. And what she, no nonsense type of leader. But she ran against males. Males were having trouble taking any type of advice or orders from a woman. That was one of the problems that she ran up against. Also, she talks about the men who really wanted sex. So they flattered and said anything to try and get sex from the civil rights workers. So that was the problem that she ran into as a leader. But she said there was another issue, and that was an issue between black women and white women. Okay? There was that controversy. Not just from the physical appearance, because remember, America had a standard of white females were beautiful, while black women couldn't measure up to that kind of a standard. No way. So there was that tension between black women and white women. And then certainly there was tension between any white females who were getting close to black females in the movement. So there was tension there. And she talks about the resentment and that issue as well. So these are some of the things that she's going to face, Doris, Doris Smith Robinson, among some of the other issues that took place in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there will be plenty of other issues as well. The next person below Ruby Doris Smith Robinson is Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer, I want to almost say, is the spiritual presence. It seems like every time I read about her, people say there was something about her that uplifted everyone that she came in contact. That if she was on a bus going to voter registration, she would start singing spirituals and sing everyone in the book by heart. But Fannie Lou Hamer, born in 1917, was the youngest of 20 kids. And when she was and she started picking cotton at 6 years old, by the way. Now, she was a timekeeper on a plantation. She and her husband, they were tenant farmers. And she went down to register to vote. When she came back to the plantation, he kicked them off because they had dared to go and register to vote. She gets involved with Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and these organizations, so she gets involved in voter registration. So on one occasion, she's taken a group to gain registration to vote. On the way back, a police officer stopped the bus. He said the bus was too yellow. Now it was a school bus. But it gives you, and this is just an example of the frivolous reasons for stopping individuals. I mean, the Montgomery campaign, Martin Luther King was stopped by the police on a number of occasions for pausing too long at a stop sign. Okay? So again, frivolous arrests. That was on one occasion. On another occasion, this is what happened. This was in 1963. She had taken individuals, she and a number of other female workers, activists, had taken a group to register to vote. On their way home, they were stopped and they were arrested. And let me quote Fannie Lou Hamer. "The policeman said, 'You bitch, we gonna make you wish you was dead.' I heard the highway patrolman tell the black man, a prisoner, 'If you don't beat her, you know what we'll do to you.' The first Negro began to beat, and I was beat until I was exhausted. The state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take a blackjack. The second Negro began to beat. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me on my head. All this on account we want to register to become first-class citizens." Now, this is Fannie Lou Hamer talking, and the beating that others got as well when they went to register to vote. And there were other ways to stop individuals from voting as well, like telling individuals that it's closed, or the registration is closed, or it only opens for an hour, come back tomorrow. So there were other ways. Certainly literacy tests. One way is if you wanted to register to vote, the registrar would say, "Here's a copy of the Mississippi State Constitution. Copy it." So you're sitting there, handwriting, copying the Mississippi State Constitution. And if you miss crossing a T or dotting an I, then you fail. The craziest literacy test was, I think it was in Mississippi or Alabama, where the registrar just put a bar of soap on the counter. Said, "How many bubbles in that bar of soap?" You know, and questions that you know you can't answer. The next photo. This is Joan Trumpauer. Joan Trumpauer. Joan Trumpauer was born in 1941 in Washington, D.C., grew up in Arlington, Virginia. And her parents didn't like black people. And she was even thinking about going to a college in Ohio, but the parents didn't want her to go there because it might be integrated. They wanted her to go to a very prestigious Southern school. So she winds up enrolling in Duke. Okay? All right. First year there, the sit-ins break out, and she gets caught up in the movement. So soon, she transfers to Tougaloo College in Mississippi, a historically black college and university right outside of Jackson, Mississippi. That's where she transfers. Not only does she transfer there, but she joins a black sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated, the only white female in the organization. And if you go down a little bit, you can see one of her sorority sisters, and they're doing their sign. And I know all about this because my wife is a Delta as well, went over at Morgan State University. And so even today, when Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, as it is today, anytime she gives a lecture, you'll see Delta Sigma Theta sorority members coming out in droves to support her. And that's the signal. And one of the things they collect are elephants, so I got like a herd in my house. But if we go to the next, okay. This is the 1963 Jackson, Mississippi sit-in. Now, Joan Trumpauer, she also was a freedom rider. She was in sit-ins plenty of times. She nearly lost her life. If you look at this, one of the famous black activists at the time was a woman by the name of Ann Moody, who wrote a book called Coming of Age in Mississippi, which is a classic now. Right here is Joan Trumpauer, sitting right next to Ann Moody. And there's this one scholar who took this famous picture and he wrote a book. And what he did is he wrote about each and every person in this photograph. What was their, where were they coming from? What were their views on all of this? Not just the protesters, but those in opposition to the protests. And really interesting book. And by the way, as you're sitting here, now the rules were you couldn't respond. No matter what was done to you, you can't respond. So if someone pours a Coca-Cola over your head, you can't respond. If they pour the sugar over you, you can't respond. If they hit you, you can't respond. So you might get knocked off the stool. You have to just get back up on the stool. Right? Sometimes taking cigarettes and burning you in the back with the cigarette. This individual, I want to say Sutter, but I can't remember his name. But actually, he was a teacher at Tougaloo. So he had some experiences as well, being one of the few, if not only, white professors at Tougaloo. This is a lot of blood because they've beaten him. Now later they will snatch Ann Moody off of here and drag her up and down off the floor, across the floor. And again, these individuals were Joan, I don't know how she escaped on some of these instances. Many of them should be dead. John Lewis, I just marveled at him. I don't know how he survived. John Lewis, who passed away a couple years ago, should have been dead a long time ago. You talk about courage. Some of these individuals, because I don't know. No way I'm sitting there. No way. No way. But that's Joan Trumpauer, Mulholland now. So again, courageous. And as a matter of fact, if you ever get a chance, there is a video called An Ordinary Hero. And by the way, let me pass this out, a couple of books up. This is about Ruby Doris Robinson that I talked about. This is one that's about Fannie Lou Hamer. Maybe I'll start this one over here on this side. So there are, and I'll mention a couple other books in but this, An Ordinary Hero, and I'll pass this around, about Joan Trumpauer. And really good, talks about her involvement. Okay, if we go up a little bit, this is Viola Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo was from Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan. She joined the Detroit NAACP right around the time of the Selma campaign in 1965, where King was going to lead a march from Selma to Montgomery regarding voting rights. And remember, that's where we get, in part, there were other issues that brought about the Voting Rights Amendment of 1965, but partly based on this march in 1965. She was so moved that she drove from Detroit down to Selma, and she would shuttle individuals because they would walk a few miles out from Selma as they had to go about 50 miles to Montgomery. So once they got out a few miles to spend the night, some would go back to Selma. And so she was one of those individuals that would shuttle them back and forth overnight. Well, one night, she's got a black male who was a marcher that she's shuttling. A group of Klansmen come up, see what's going on, and they fire into the car, killing Viola Liuzzo. Now, the young man had so much of her blood on him, the Klansmen did get out and look in the car, but they thought he was dead too. The black man wasn't dead. He just had so much blood on him and pretended like he was dead. But she was dead because she got the full blast because it was on her side. And actually, there was an FBI informant in the car of the Klansman, and that's why we know what was going on. But here, Viola Liuzzo killed during that Selma campaign. And I've probably got a couple minutes, so let me quickly mention two other individuals. If you go down one more, that's Gloria Richardson, to bring it home. This is the eastern shore of Maryland, in Cambridge. Okay? And Gloria Richardson, just an amazing individual. Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. Trying to, again, bring about justice. There's going to be a demonstration, rioters, militia called out, she's arrested. But again, this idea of continuing these sit-ins and these protests to bring about change. Gloria Richardson. And then one last person, Diane Nash, right here. And then the last one is her a little bit later in life. But Diane Nash was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in Nashville. Now, I mentioned the Freedom Rides. Ultimately, and the founder of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, was James Farmer, who organized the Freedom Rides. Eventually, there was so much opposition and so much violence on the Freedom Rides that Farmer had to literally cancel them. The Greyhound bus driver said, "We're not driving anymore." And they were white, but they said, "Wait a minute, there's just too much violence. We're not driving anymore." So he canceled it. But Diane Nash in Nashville, Tennessee, wasn't going to hear that. What she did is she got volunteers in 2 cars, and they drove down, I think it was to Birmingham, Alabama, in order to continue, to make sure that the Freedom Rides continued. And so she too was part of the sit-ins, the demonstrations, risking her life, involved in SNCC, so long time activist. And if we go to the last slide, this is a list of some suggested reading, and at the top is that one I mentioned at the dark end of the street, Black Women Rape. One I'm passing around, Soon We Will Not Cry, about Doris Robinson. This little light of mine I'm passing around about Fannie Lou Hamer. Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, Barbara Ransby. We Shall Not Be Moved, the Jackson Woolworth sit-in and the movement it inspired. This is Mike O'Brien. This is the person who took that picture and began to investigate everybody in that protest. And I heard him speak a couple years ago along with Joan Trumpauer, and it was excellent. So that's his book, and then the video, An Ordinary Hero. The Struggles of Colonel Gloria Richardson, Black Liberation, Hands on the Freedom Plow, Personal Accounts by Women in SNCC, and My Life, My Love, My Legacy by Coretta Scott King. That's her autobiography. So they're still doing a lot of work on digging out these individuals who don't really get mentioned because so much is talked about with King, and he's such a focus. So there's still a lot of work that individuals are doing, and it's an ongoing investigation and fascinating because some of these individuals, the young college, in fact, one of the individuals you know real well who joined SNCC was Marion Barry. Dropped out of school to get involved in the sit-in movement. And a lot of individuals were doing that. Just some courageous individuals. I mean, I don't know if I could have done that. For example, one, the mindset where SNCC workers would be sent into the South, and let's say all of us, in an integrated group, we go into a town. Now, as soon as we knock on anybody's door, they're already in trouble. First of all, we're outsiders. We knock on their door. Are they involved in what we're doing in this civil rights struggle? So they're in trouble. And some individuals were upset. How do we protect these individuals? How can we protect them if we're nonviolent? And so that's going to be an issue. One individual, and sometimes they would stay in people's homes. So let's say we're staying in someone in Mississippi, we're staying in their home, and they wake us up in the morning, as happened in this case, and he said, come with me. And they went outside and looked at the activist's car. And whatever they put on the hood of the car had been disturbed, which means a bomb. You got to be careful. So they had to slowly push the car away from the house so that the bomb wouldn't explode. The mindset. There was a white female who went down to register individuals to vote. She said that she was living with this family. The head of the household, the man, would not sit down at the table and eat with her. Because in the South, one of the touches, as I mentioned, was that miscegenation. In fact, you couldn't even look at a white female because you might be accused of eye rape. So here he's in his own house. He wouldn't sit down at the table with her because it had been so ingrained in him that you have to be very careful around white females. Till one day she just told him, Mr. So-and-so, sit down. And that's when he sat down at the table with her. And she said after that, it was okay. But before then, that was ingrained. When the civil rights movement sang, we shall overcome, or one of the things one of the next stanza was, we are not afraid. We are not afraid. They were again trying to bolster themselves because of the fear. You never knew what was going to happen. So these individuals under the radar, it's a fascinating story, and more we're beginning to examine some of these individuals. And these individuals we talked about today are just phenomenal. So let me shut up because historians do like to talk. So any questions though?